Revenge is a silver blade, silent and sharp, waiting for the perfect moment to deliver the final, crushing blow. Follow the high-stakes journey of a soul who navigated the path of betrayal to find their ultimate redemption. Subscribe now and see how the final debt is paid in full.
My name is Thomas Whitfield. I am 65 years old. I spent 38 years as a civil engineer designing bridges that still stand across 6 states. And for the past 3 months, I have been watching my nephew dismantle everything I built, brick by brick, with a smile on his face and a forged signature on his lips. Last Friday evening, at the retirement dinner my wife organized to celebrate the end of my career and the beginning of whatever comes next, he finally reached for the thing he had been circling for months. What he did not know was that I had been ready for him since February, and the glass he so carefully prepared for me was about to end his life as he knew it. Before I tell you how I watched him fall apart in front of 60 of my closest friends and colleagues, I want to ask you something. Drop your location in the comments below. Tell me where you are watching from tonight. And if you believe that a man who spent 4 decades calculating load tolerances and stress points on structures that carry millions of people safely across rivers and valleys might just be capable of calculating exactly how much weight a decade lie can bear before it collapses, hit that subscribe button. Because this is what happened. The Meridian Room at the Harborview Club was lit with warm amber light and decorated with navy and gold, my wife Margaret's idea. She had spent 6 weeks planning the evening, 60 guests, people I had known for decades, former colleagues from the firm, old university friends, neighbors from the house we have lived in for 31 years, Margaret's sisters and their husbands. Everyone was dressed well. Everyone was laughing. The room smelled like cedar and good wine, and something roasted in butter. I was not looking at the room. I was watching my nephew across the space near the drinks table. He was standing with his wife beside the bar cart, and his right hand was hovering near the glass that had been set aside for my toast. The event coordinator had marked it with a small gold ribbon because Margaret had requested a specific vintage of bourbon for the moment. My nephew's wife was talking to someone I did not recognize, laughing too brightly. My nephew was not laughing. He was focused. I saw his hand move. It was a small motion, practiced, almost invisible. His fingers dipped briefly into his jacket pocket and then curled around the glass for just a moment. When he set it back down, the gold ribbon was still there, perfect and undisturbed. He turned away and picked up his own drink and smiled at someone across the room. I kept my face completely still. Margaret came to stand beside me and took my arm. She was wearing the blue dress she had bought for our anniversary trip to Savannah 3 years ago, and she looked more beautiful than she had any right to look at 62. She did not know what I had seen. She did not know what I had known for the past 3 months. I had kept her out of it deliberately. I needed her to be herself this evening, warm and unsuspecting and genuine, because 60 people were about to watch something unfold, and every reaction in that room needed to be real. My nephew walked toward us. He was 38, tall, with my late brother's jaw and none of my late brother's character. He had worked in real estate development for 12 years, and he drove a car he could not afford and wore a watch that cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payments. "Uncle Thomas," he said, extending the glass with the gold ribbon. "Margaret asked me to bring this over. The good stuff, right? For the toast." I looked at the glass. I looked at him. I smiled the way I had been smiling at him for 3 months, warmly, gratefully, like a man who sees only family when he looks at the person handing him a drink. "Thank you," I said. "That's kind." He patted my shoulder and said he would find his wife and be back for the toast. I watched him walk away. I held the glass at my side. My old friend Victor, who had been standing 6 feet to my left for the past 4 minutes exactly as we had arranged, drifted casually to my side under the pretense of refilling his wine at the nearby cart. We had known each other since graduate school. I trusted him with my life. Tonight, I was trusting him with something more complicated. Without looking at him, I set my glass on the tray he was holding near the cart. He replaced it with an identical glass. Same bourbon, same pour, no gold ribbon. I pocketed the original ribbon and tied the new one around the replacement glass in 3 seconds. I had practiced the motion 40 times in my kitchen the week before. When my nephew glanced back across the room a minute later, I was holding my drink and talking to Margaret's sister about her garden in Portland. 60 people raised their glasses when the toast came. I drank. My nephew drank. And then, about 4 minutes later, my nephew set his glass down very carefully on the nearest table, pressed 2 fingers to his temple, and said something quietly to his wife. I watched the color drain from his face. I watched his knees soften. I watched his wife grab his arm with both hands, her eyes wide, her bright smile collapsing into something panicked and unrecognizable. He did not fall dramatically. He sat down heavily in the nearest chair and then slid sideways, and his wife screamed his name and someone called for help and the beautiful amber room came apart at the seams. I stood with my bourbon in my hand and I watched. And Margaret gripped my arm and asked me what was happening, and I told her I did not know yet, but that I would find out. The ambulance was there in 11 minutes. I know this hospital. I designed a pedestrian bridge on their campus 20 years ago, and they put a small plaque on it with my name. The emergency room attending physician recognized me. She was professional and efficient, and she came out to the waiting area after 40 minutes and said that my nephew was stable, that they had administered treatment, and that his blood work had returned results that were, in her words, deeply concerning. We found a significant concentration of a sedative compound, she said, specifically a benzodiazepine at a level inconsistent with any prescribed dosage. This was not accidental ingestion. She paused. The police have been contacted. A detective is on the way. My nephew's wife went very still. She was standing 3 feet from me, and I watched something behind her eyes shift from fear into something else, something calculating, something that looked, for just a moment, like it was running the numbers on a situation that had gone catastrophically wrong. The detective's name was Louise Hartley. She was in her early 50s, practical shoes, a quiet voice, and the kind of eyes that seemed to be filing everything away, even while the rest of her face maintains a completely neutral expression. She interviewed each of us separately in an administrative office the hospital provided. When it was my turn, I closed the door and sat down and told her everything. I told her about the past 3 months. I told her what I had discovered. I told her what I had done. She took notes, and she did not interrupt, and when I finished, she looked at me for a long moment. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, "you're telling me that you knew someone was going to attempt to drug you tonight, that you prepared for it in advance, and that you deliberately allowed the altered drink to be consumed by the person who prepared it?" "That is correct." "And you have documentation of the larger plan?" "I have 3 months of documentation," I said. "Audio recordings, surveillance footage, financial records, correspondence. I have a complete picture of what they intended to do and exactly how they intended to do it. All of it has already been transmitted to a secure server, and my attorney has copies." She looked at me for another moment. "Tell me everything, from the beginning." So I did. It started in February on a Wednesday afternoon. My nephew had come to the house for what he called a casual visit, just family, just to check in. He sat at my kitchen table and drank my coffee and said, in what he probably imagined was a casual voice, that he had been thinking about my retirement and wondering whether I had given serious thought to estate planning. He mentioned that a lot of men in my position, men approaching the end of long careers with substantial assets, found it valuable to have someone they trusted helping to manage things. He mentioned that financial management was a natural extension of what he did professionally. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that he had connections to some excellent elder care specialists. I told him I had an attorney and a financial advisor, and that everything was in good order. I thanked him for his concern. He nodded and smiled and changed the subject. That night I could not sleep. I lay in the dark and listened to Margaret breathing, and I thought about the way my nephew had looked at me across the kitchen table, not with warmth, with assessment. The way I had sometimes seen inexperienced inspectors look at old infrastructure, cataloging weaknesses, estimating what it would take to bring it down. I made a phone call the next morning to a man named Daniel Forsyth. We had worked together on a federal contracting project 15 years ago when Daniel was still with a government investigative office. He had gone private since then. He was expensive and methodical and discreet. Within 10 days, Daniel had delivered his first report. What I read in it made me set the pages down and walk to the window and stand there for a long time looking at the oak tree in my front yard. My nephew's real estate development company was not a development company. It was a paper structure, a shell built on top of debt. He had not completed a profitable project in 4 years. He owed money to 3 private lenders, 2 of which had already moved toward legal action. His wife, whose family had money when he married her, had quietly depleted most of what her parents left her. They were selling things quietly: furniture, a second car, small art pieces they had bought in better years. They were desperate in the way that makes people dangerous. Then Daniel found the connection to a man named Gerald Fowler. Dr. Gerald Fowler presented himself as a geriatric psychiatrist in private practice. He had a website and a clean professional headshot and a list of credentials. He also had a license that had been quietly revoked 22 months earlier after an investigation found that he had produced fraudulent cognitive assessments for 3 elderly patients. In each of those cases, the patients had subsequently been declared legally incompetent. In each of those cases, family members with close financial interests had petitioned for and received guardianship or power of attorney. In 2 of the cases, the patient's assets had been substantially redirected within 18 months. In one of those cases, the patient was a retired contractor named William Brower, 71 years old, who had died in a residential facility 14 months after being declared incompetent. His daughter from a previous marriage had received almost nothing. His second wife's son had received almost everything. Gerald Fowler and my nephew had known each other for 6 years. They had met through a mutual contact in a real estate circle. Daniel had a photograph of them having lunch together in November, 2 months before my nephew first visited my kitchen to talk about estate planning. I read the report twice. Then I read it a third time. What they wanted was straightforward, and it was monstrous. My wife and I have built something over 38 years of work and saving and careful choices. The house is paid for. The investments are sound. There is real estate in 2 states. There are accounts that Margaret and I have lived modestly to protect because we wanted something to leave behind, for our children, for the people we love. The total is roughly $11 million. My nephew wanted access to that. Not eventually, not through natural inheritance at the end of a long and full life. Now, immediately, with me, removed from the equation, declared incompetent, managed and warehoused somewhere, while a man with a revoked license signed the paperwork that would hand control of everything to a pair of people who would spend it in 5 years and leave nothing. And my daughter. She is 33 and she lives in Austin and she calls every Sunday. If I had been successfully declared incompetent, if guardianship had been granted to my nephew, she would have had legal grounds to contest it. But contests take time and money, and they are emotionally devastating. And people who do this for a living know how to delay and obfuscate and exhaust their opposition. Daniel had found correspondence between my nephew and a paralegal that suggested they had already considered this possibility and had a strategy for it. They had thought about everything except the possibility that I was not the man they had decided to see when they looked at me. I am 65 years old. My hair is white and my knees are not what they were, and I have readers on every flat surface in my house. I also built a pedestrian bridge once that the city's original contractor said could not be done within budget. I also passed the professional engineering examination on the first attempt, when the average pass rate was 34%. I also once diagnosed a fatigue crack in a suspension cable from a moving vehicle because something in the visual geometry did not add up, and I could not let it go until I understood why. I do not stop pulling at a thread until I know what it is connected to. Over the following weeks, Daniel continued building the file. My nephew met with Gerald Fowler 3 times. Daniel photographed the meetings. In the 3rd meeting, which Daniel's colleague managed to capture partial audio of from a nearby position, the 2 men discussed timelines. They were looking at a window of approximately 6 weeks. The retirement dinner was the event they had settled on. A large gathering, high emotion, plausible conditions for an older man to seem confused or unstable. My nephew's plan, as nearly as Daniel could reconstruct it, was to administer a sedative that would cause disorientation and impaired motor function, in front of 60 witnesses. Gerald Fowler would be present at the dinner as a guest, introduced as a friend of the family. He would respond to the apparent medical episode with calm authority, suggest that what he was observing had characteristics consistent with a pattern he had noticed in recent months, and recommend immediate evaluation. He had forms prepared. He had a care facility relationship that would handle the logistics from there. By the time I understood the full shape of what they were planning, I had already decided that the retirement dinner would proceed exactly as scheduled. Margaret would plan her evening. The guests would come. The bourbon would be poured. And I would be ready. I contacted Detective Hartley 6 weeks before the event. She already knew Gerald Fowler's name. She told me that his previous cases were under renewed scrutiny, and that the investigation had been hampered by lack of direct evidence of a scheme in progress. I told her I was going to provide her with a scheme in progress. We spent 2 hours in her office, going over exactly what I was prepared to do and what legal parameters I needed to stay within to ensure that what I gathered would be usable. I am an engineer by training. I understand the value of doing things correctly the first time. Daniel placed a small device in my suit jacket pocket that evening. It captured audio in a 12-foot radius. 2 of his associates were present at the dinner in the capacity of catering staff. With Margaret's advanced knowledge and blessing, once I finally, reluctantly, told her the outline of what was happening, she cried for an hour. Then she asked me what she needed to do, and she did it without complaint. Because after 39 years, she knows who I am and I know who she is. My nephew's wife was arrested in the hospital waiting room. My nephew was arrested in his hospital bed the following morning when he was coherent enough to be formally charged. Gerald Fowler was taken into custody at his home address that Saturday evening when Detective Hartley's team moved on information that had been building for months and was now, thanks to 3 months of Daniel's work and 1 Friday night at the Harborview Club, more than sufficient. The charges were serious: attempted battery, conspiracy to commit elder fraud, fraudulent practice in connection with my nephew's wife, who had signed correspondence and helped coordinate logistics. For Gerald Fowler, the charges included the current conspiracy and reopened investigation into the cases of William Brower and 2 other elderly individuals whose families had been trying for years to get someone to listen to them. My daughter flew in from Austin on Saturday morning. She sat at my kitchen table, the same table where my nephew had sat in February with his coffee and his casual questions, and she looked at me for a long time without saying anything. "I need you to tell me all of it," she finally said. So I did. All of it. She cried at the part about William Brower. So did I. The trial lasted 11 days. The prosecution used Daniel's surveillance footage, the audio recordings, the financial records showing the depth of my nephew's debts, and the money transfers that had been prepared in anticipation of obtaining access to my accounts. They used the meeting records between my nephew and Gerald Fowler. They used the correspondence that detailed the plan, including a message my nephew had sent to Fowler 3 days before the dinner that said, in plain language, that after Friday the old man would not be a problem anymore, and they could move quickly on the next steps before anyone could organize an effective challenge. Gerald Fowler's prior victims' families testified. William Brower's daughter sat in that courtroom and spoke about her father in a voice that barely held together and did not break once, and every person in that room understood exactly what was at stake in these cases, exactly what kind of person treats an elderly human being as an asset to be liquidated. The jury was out for less than 6 hours. My nephew received 14 years. His wife, who had been less centrally involved but involved nonetheless, received 4 years and restitution requirements. Gerald Fowler received 26 years. The judge, in his sentencing statement, noted that Fowler's actions had contributed to the suffering and death of at least one vulnerable person, and that the sentence was intended to reflect the gravity of a pattern of conduct that exploited the most fundamental fears of 10, aging and dependency. My nephew did not look at me when the verdict was read. His wife did. I do not know what she expected to see in my face. Whatever she was looking for, I do not think she found it. There is a question I have been asked several times since all of this became known to our family and to some of the wider community of people who knew us. The question is whether I feel guilty about what happened to my nephew, whether I grieve for him the way I might have expected to grieve for family. The honest answer is that I grieve for the person I thought I knew. I grieve for the young man who came to my brother's funeral at the age of 19 and stood at the graveside and cried openly and let me put my arm around his shoulders. I grieve for the version of him that I carried in my understanding of what our family was. That person and the man who handed me a doctored drink at my retirement party are not the same person, and I do not know at what point one became the other, and I have stopped trying to find the exact moment because I do not think it will give me what I am looking for. Some things cannot be reverse engineered. It is May now. Margaret and I have spent several evenings on the back porch watching the light change over the yard in the way it does this time of year, gold going to copper, going to the particular gray-blue that comes just before dark. The oak tree is full. The neighbor's dog barks at something unseen every evening around 7, and then stops. It is quiet in the way that feels earned. 2 weeks after the sentencing, I received a letter. It came from a woman named Carol Brower, the daughter of William Brower, the retired contractor who had died in that facility. She wrote that because of my testimony and the renewed investigation my case had catalyzed, auditors had found clear evidence of asset misappropriation in her father's case. The facility where he had spent his last 14 months was under regulatory review. 2 civil suits had been filed and were moving forward. Her father's remaining estate, what had not yet been transferred, had been legally frozen pending resolution. She wrote that she had been trying for nearly 3 years to get someone to listen. She thanked me for being someone who had the resources and the knowledge and, as she put it, the stubbornness to see it through. I keep her letter on my desk. Margaret has read it. My daughter has read it. Some mornings I read it again before I start the day. I want to say something directly to whoever is watching this, because I know from the conversations I have had with friends and former colleagues that what happened to me is not unusual. It is, in fact, far more common than most people want to believe. There are people who specifically target older men and women, people who look at age and see vulnerability, who look at retirement and see surrender, who see white hair and quiet evenings on the porch and believe they have found something soft enough to take apart without resistance. They are wrong about that more often than they know. I spent 38 years calculating the exact point at which a structure becomes unsafe. I spent 38 years understanding how things fail, how stress accumulates invisibly, how a flaw that seems negligible compounds over time into catastrophic collapse. The people who came after what I built did not understand that the man they were dealing with had spent his entire professional life thinking about exactly these kinds of problems. But I also want to say this. Not everyone who gets targeted has the resources I had. Not everyone has a contact like Daniel, or the professional background that made me credible when I walked into Detective Hartley's office, or the financial cushion that allowed me to spend 3 months and a significant amount of money building a case before I moved. Some people do not know what is happening until it is already too late. Some people ask for help and are not believed. Some families have these conversations and the person being targeted is too frightened or too isolated to act. So if you are watching this and something feels wrong, trust that feeling. If someone in your family is suddenly very interested in your finances, in your mental sharpness, in whether you have thought about who would make decisions for you if something happened, pay attention. Ask questions. Talk to an attorney you have chosen yourself, not one someone else has suggested. Talk to your doctor. Talk to someone outside the situation. And, if you know someone who might be in this position, someone older, someone whose family dynamics have recently shifted in ways that feel off, check in with them. Ask directly. Stay in their lives. The sunset is coming in low through the study window as I write this. Margaret called from the kitchen 20 minutes ago to say that dinner would be ready soon, and I told her I would be there shortly. The oak tree is dark against the pink sky. The neighbor's dog has started and stopped again right on schedule. I am 65 years old. My knees still ache in cold weather, and I still need my readers to see the fine print, and there is a scar on my left hand from a construction site accident in 1997 that I have grown fond of in the way you grow fond of things that remind you of the work you did. I am 65 years old, and I am still standing. And the bridge I designed over the river on the north side of the city is still standing too, and 40,000 people cross it every single day, without giving a thought to the calculations that keep them safe. That is, in the end, exactly what good work is supposed to do. I folded Carol Brower's letter back into thirds and placed it in the top drawer of my desk, right where I can find it on the mornings when I need it. Then I pushed back my chair and walked toward the kitchen, where the light was warm and my wife was waiting. And outside the window, the last of the day was almost gone, and I was still here.